From then on, Barbara stopped referring to us as the new people, and suddenly in her eyes, we were Bonnie's owners. She thought Bonnie was fantastic. The basic feeding and treatment of dogs improved greatly after the establishment of these dog shows.
If you're passionate about Basset Hounds, this podcast is for you.
This is WOEBGON, the Basset Hound podcast. I'm your host, Don Bullock. Hi there, and welcome to WOEBGON, the Basset Hound podcast. This is episode 12. I can't believe that I've recorded a whole year's worth of these podcasts, so this episode starts the second year of this podcast, and I'm real happy about that. I appreciate all of you who have watched the past videos or listened to the episodes on podcast services, wherever you listen to podcasts. I hope those of you who haven't listened to all the past podcasts will go back and listen to them. For those of you who are new here, I'm Don Bullock. My wife Pam and I have owned Basset Hounds since 1977 and have shown him in AKC confirmation shows since 1991. We've bred numerous AKC champions and grand champions. Our early years with Basset Hounds were covered in episodes 1 through 9. In the past two, I covered internet fraud, which is a very important topic that everyone should know about. But back in episode 9, I told the beginning of Mandy's story. In this episode, I'm going to break up the story of Mandy because we ended up getting another girl from Heather. Heather was planning another litter and wanted our boy Moose to be the sire. We were thrilled. As payment for the stud fee, Heather offered us the pick of the girls in the litter since she was only interested in a boy. We agreed, and when it came time for the breeding, we took Moose down to Heather's place to stay until she had done the breeding. Heather was almost positive there were puppies fairly early on. She was right. When an x-ray was done, they thought they saw 4 puppies. Our timing was really pretty bad. When the weekend came that the litter was expected, Pam and I, unfortunately, were out of town. We were up in Carmel, California with some PT cruiser enthusiasts cruising through Carmel and along the coast. We got a call about 10 a.m. Sunday morning that the puppies were coming. Heather and her mother were whelping the litter at her mother's home in Laguna Niguel, California. We were somewhere above Solvang on a beach where they have real big, huge elephant seals that rest on the beach when the call came in. After a quick explanation to the others in our group we were cruising with, Pam and I headed south as quickly as we could, of course without catching the ire of the CHP as we went along. We arrived at Heather's mother's house sometime late that afternoon. 2 male puppies had already been born and a third puppy was on the way. Joan was an expert at whelping puppies. She and Heather took care of what was needed to be done, so Pam and I just watched. That third puppy, another boy, came soon after we arrived. That meant we only had one more chance for us to get a girl. It seems like we waited an eternity for the 4th puppy to come. Joan and Heather even discussed the possibility of an emergency C-section, and Joan's husband even readied the car in case it was needed. Finally, early that evening, the puppy started to come. Suddenly, there she was. I distinctly remember Heather's mother turning to us and saying, "Here's your girl." We all were excited that there was a girl in the litter. I have to add in here that nothing's more exciting than seeing your puppies being born, or when you do a C-section and seeing the results of what you've tried to accomplish with the breeding and seeing the attributes of these puppies. Even when they're first born, sometimes you can tell which ones are going to be the great new show dogs and which ones are going to be a pet for someone and make a family really happy with having a new puppy. Over the next month, we made some trips down to see the puppies. It was about an hour and a half one way with good traffic, sometimes longer. Pam and I truly loved watching this litter grow. Our girl looked great. She seemed to have a lot of the good qualities that we wanted. We registered as Vogue's WOEBGON Bonnie Miss. Yes, that's Heather's kennel name, Vogue Bassett's, and WOEBGON was our kennel name. Bonnie Miss was the name of a root beer at one time in the United States, and we liked the name. Remember, we named our girls after sodas and juices, and boys had beer names. Bonnie, like the rest of the litter, looked more like Moose than the mother, Jelly. Oh, remember I mentioned earlier that we got interested in Heather's Bassett's because her boy Peanut was winning a lot, and he had just fantastic movement. Well, Jelly was his sister. The fact that the puppies looked a lot like Moose was what we and Heather were hoping for. Bonnie turned out to be nice, well-built, and she is a beautiful Basset Hound, but fairly large. I distinctly remember showing up with Bonnie at her very first show. She had just turned 6 months old. It was at the Orange Empire Kennel Club show that was held indoors at the Orange Show Event Center in San Bernardino, California. As I walked through a crowded aisle next to the ring, I passed one of the very long-time, highly respected breeders in Southern California, Barbara Dunning. As I did, she stopped me in my tracks and got a closer look at Bonnie. From then on, Barbara stopped referring to us as the new people, and suddenly in her eyes, we were Bonnie's owners. She thought Bonnie was fantastic. As Barbara predicted early on, Bonnie did well in the show ring. She got her 2 required majors fairly early and quickly. After Bonnie earned her 3rd major at a show in Pasadena, California, one of the well-known established breeders, Joe Newmeyer, approached me and asked me, "When are you going to finish that girl?" She wanted Bonnie out of her way so her girl could win. With me showing her, Bonnie became an AKC champion before she was a year old. I continued to show Bonnie and she did well. At one show, I was showing Bonnie in the Best of Breed class, and she was the first girl in line after the males. That's the way the judge wanted them all lined up. He wanted all the males and then all the females. The judge stated, "I'd like to see the dogs go around together." Now, for those listeners who aren't familiar with how canines are referred to at shows, males are referred to as dogs as opposed to bitches, which are the girls. I wanted to make sure that the judge meant that only the boys were supposed to go around. So I said to the judge, "You mean the dogs, not the bitches?" He said, "Yes." So I didn't move. Suddenly, the judge motioned to me to take Bonnie around the ring with the boys, so I did. As we made it about halfway around the ring, the judge suddenly realized what he'd done, and he had me lead the rest of the Basset Pound class around the ring. I'm not sure if we won Best of Breed that day because the judge was embarrassed or he truly liked her. I'll leave Bonnie's story here for now. The next chapter in her life was something we hope that we and no one else has to experience. That's a whole episode in itself. Looking back on that snafu when the judge had me go around with the males makes me wonder if perhaps the judge was thinking that Bonnie was what some call a doggy bitch, meaning her features may have seemed more masculine than feminine to him. It wasn't the only time a judge mistook Bonnie for a male. This past weekend, another incident like this happened. Pam had a similar situation with Emmy. The judge approached Emmy on the ramp and said, quote, "Hello, handsome," end quote. Pam said she didn't know whether to tell the judge or let her find out on her own. She chose the latter, and when the judge figured it out, they both had a good laugh. Perhaps these judges are used to judging sporting breeds, where many of the breeds have different height and or weight requirements. Remember, I said Bonnie was a big girl, but she wasn't over 14 inches. The Bracco Italiano is a good example of the height requirement differences in sporting breeds. Quote, the height at the withers between 21 and 27 inches. Preferred size for males is 23 to 27 inches. Preferred size for females is 21 to 25 inches, end quote. And then there's the Golden Retriever, where their standard is even more specific, including disqualifications when they don't meet height requirements. It states, quote, males 23 to 24 inches in height at the withers. Females 21.5 to 22.5 inches. Dogs up to 1 inch above or below the standard size should be proportionately penalized. Deviation in height of more than 1 inch from the standard shall disqualify, end quote. Plus they have a weight restriction. Quote, weight for dogs is 65 to 75 pounds, bitches 55 to 65 pounds, end quote. According to the AKC standard for Basset Hounds, there are no differences in the description of males and females. The standard for both is exactly the same. Remember, the AKC standard for Basset Hounds only has a height requirement that's for both males and females. Quote, size. The height should not exceed 14 inches. Height over 15 inches at the highest point of the shoulder blades is a disqualification, end quote. In the current AKC standard, there is no mention anywhere of weight or anything else that would separate males from females. Everything is exactly the same for both. That's one of my standard myths, because Basset Hound males and females shouldn't be judged differently. If a judge seems to think they're a doggy bitch or a bitchy dog, that really shouldn't be considered. It's not a beauty contest. It's not, wow, I really love those features in a male or a female. That's not part of the consideration. Fortunately, in the case with Bonnie, the judge liked her and awarded her Best of Breed. But last weekend, after winning Best of Breed and Best of Breed Owner Handled on Saturday with a large entry, on Sunday, Emmy was left out of the ribbons with fewer Bassets in the ring. Whether or not the judge considered Emmy to be too doggy, we'll just never know. While each breed has a written standard that describes the perfect example of the breed, it's up to each judge to interpret those standards and apply them to the dogs that are presented to them in their show ring. In some countries, judges are expected to make reports after the shows explaining their placements. At least those exhibitors and owners have some idea of what the judge thought. Here in the United States, we often just wonder and speculate about what the judge just decided. Sometimes we leave the show ring just saying to ourselves, what was he thinking? It's just part of the game. This brings me to the topic of the establishment of modern dog shows and the kennel clubs that regulate them. Here in the United States, our main kennel club is the American Kennel Club, or AKC. Prior to its establishment, we had the Kennel Club, which was established in England. Here's some history on the reason they were both established, along with the establishment of breed standards. And it also leads to the establishment of the first dog shelter. The fact that the establishment of dog shelters is somewhat connected with dog shows is certainly something that's unexpected in today's world, where breeders are often blamed for the need for shelters, and animal rights groups are doing anything and everything they can do to eliminate breeding. It's not a coincidence that the world's first professional dog show and the world's first famous dog shelter opened within 18 months of each other. The first competitive dog show held in June 1859 in the town hall at Newcastle upon Tyne, and the founding in London in December 1860 of what would become the Battersea Dog and Cat Home are surely evidence of the acceptance of pet keeping in Victorian Britain and the fact it was widespread among all classes. While enthusiasm for dogs and other companion animals certainly predates the Victorians, we can argue that it became extremely popular and acceptable during this time. I'm planning on covering the shelters and modern rescue groups and the animal rights groups and their effect on what's going on in our world in future podcast episodes that are dedicated to those specific topics. In this episode, I'm just addressing the early concepts and development of our modern dog shows. What historians consider to be the first competitive dog show, held June 1859 in Newcastle upon Tyne, was an addition to a long-established agricultural show. Now, I found sources that claim that the show was a livestock show, and others state it was a poultry show. No matter what kind of show it was, the dog show was added to it. The idea for such a venture came from Richard Brailsford, the head gamekeeper of the Knowingsley estate of Prime Minister Lord Derby. He proposed a show for sporting dogs on the same principles as cattle, sheep, horses, and poultry shows, and also for a society to improve the quality of the nation's dogs. His particular concern was the degeneration of pointers and setters, which were used as gun dogs in game shooting. Its country character was clear, as only setters and pointers, which are sporting breeds, were shown, and the prizes that were given out to the winners were guns. Yes, guns were offered as prizes to the winning dog owners, something that can't even be imagined in today's world. This show was a rather low-key start to what would be, by the end of the century, a highly popular pastime, with dogs becoming fashionable among all classes of society. This popularity of dogs and shows had huge implications on canine breeding. The first show to include non-sporting breeds was held in Birmingham later in 1859 and was such a success that later that year, the Birmingham Dog Show Society ran the first national dog show. For that show, there were 267 entries with 30 breeds, judged in 32 classes. Members of the aristocracy began showing up among the names of the prize winners, making dog fancying fashionable and respectable. By the end of the 1860s, the National Dog Show was attracting over 700 dogs and 20,000 paying visitors. Only a year after the Birmingham event, the Illustrated London News triumphantly declared that dog shows were, quote, a great national fact at last, end quote. The Confirmation Dog Show started in London in 1861, but took off in 1862 when a show at Holborn did not include sporting dogs and was billed as, quote, the exhibition of fancy and other dogs, end quote. In the same year, a monster dog show was organized at the New Agricultural Hall in Islington. There were over 1,000 entries, including a pack of foxhounds from the Duke of Beaufort's estate at Badmington. The famous painter, Sir Edwin Landseer, served as a judge. The promoters aimed to attract all social classes, charging 5 shillings for an exclusive opening day, cutting the price in half to attract the middle classes on the second day, before 3 public days at just 1 shilling per day. The show attracted over 60,000 visitors. The London Review recognized the virtue of dog shows in the development of purebred dogs through the efforts of breeders. Shows had rapidly become sites of middle and upper class sociability and fashion, but their standing was threatened by reports of unfair competition, if not outright fraud. Dogs were faked by fanciers coloring the animal's coat or eyes, cropping ears, or substituting canine on display with another dog. Also, the halls were noisy, smelly, and known to spread diseases such as dog distemper. Furthermore, judges were accused of ignorance, bias, and even accepting bribes. A report in the publication called The Field sympathized with the task of judging, particularly as there were no agreed standards for the different types of dogs. Prizes, prestige, and money were at stake, as they were with other competitive sports at the time. There were calls for rules and regulations. One answer was for each dog show to have a standards committee for, quote, those gentlemen who possess a knowledge of any particular class of dog, end quote, to contribute their standard of perfection, and for the committee to consider all the contributions and produce an agreed standard around the parts and points. In other words, each show was to have its own standards committee for all of the different breeds of dogs. By doing that, however, they did not resolve the issue of the difference between shows. As a result, there were calls for national rules and standards. Various attempts were made to introduce and enforce such a scheme, but none was successful until the creation of the Kennel Club in 1873. The Kennel Club published rules for shows, including the appointment of judges and adapting the notion of points from livestock shows, proposed specific shapes and sizes and colors for the various parts of the dog's anatomy. It also published a stud book, which was a public record of the lineage of the dogs to counter false claims of identity of animals and preserve value. As I mentioned in previous episodes, these stud books are still maintained today. They're the foundation of our kennel clubs. The ancestry of any pure dog can be traced using them. Speaking of breed standards, I saw an interesting question on Facebook this week. Someone was asking why their Basset Hound had longer legs than most other Basset Hounds. Now, before I comment any further, I totally agree with the person who posted this question, that no matter why this Basset Hound has longer legs than most, it should be cherished and loved, just like any other dog. It's not a reason to think poorly about the dog at all. He's a wonderful member of their family. It's all in the pedigree for the Basset Hound. When the Kennel Club and AKC and other national kennel clubs started keeping stud books, they allowed the ancestry of purebred dogs to be traced. Standards for each breed were established as well. In regards to this question, the AKC standard for Basset Hound states, quote, the distance from the deepest point of the chest to the ground, while must be adequate to allow free movement when working the field, is not to be more than 1/3 the total height of the withers, and that's the shoulder blades, of an adult Basset, end quote. It's obvious that somewhere in the pedigree of this Basset, breeders were not being careful about their breeding to the breed standard. And unfortunately, it's just far too common today for that to happen. These measures to set standards that were required for fair sport at shows had profound consequences for dogs. These conformation standards defined a particular segment of dog varieties, which were termed to be pure breeds, and created a way for which dogs have been classified ever since. Yes, dog shows today maintain these same standards or improved standards as descriptions of the specific breeds. This meant that dogs that weren't purebred were referred to as mongrels or mutts, as the term we use today, or perhaps mixed breeds would be better to describe them. As a consequence, show dogs were remade and standardized within restricted physical forms, and this activity created a new language and new ideas of thinking about dogs, and in turn, new practices for breeding, feeding, training, and treating dogs became established. The basic feeding and treatment of dogs improved greatly after the establishment of these dog shows. The Victorian culture fully supported the keeping of dogs as pets, along with cats and other animals. More dogs were being brought into homes as companions instead of just existing as utilitarian animals for farming and hunting. This was happening throughout all the social classes in Great Britain, not just the aristocracy. I'd like to point out here that while men were the ones mostly involved with hunting and in the sporting breeds, women were also extremely important in these early days of dog shows and breeding. Some of the most significant improvements in purebred dogs came from women. In future episodes, we'll find out that women made highly significant contributions to Basset Hounds. The top Victorian pet was the dog. In both Victorian art and literature, dogs were held to embody the qualities that were celebrated in the Victorian age: loyalty, fidelity, and honor. Cats, in contrast, although they were kept in many households to kill vermin, were viewed less fondly. Some writers on pet keeping suggested they were untrustworthy. The affection lavished on pets and the growing appreciation in the Victorian period of animal life contributed to the movement for animal protection. The RSPCA was founded in 1824. For those who are unfamiliar with the RSPCA in Great Britain, on June 16, 1824, Reverend Arthur Broome, credited as the Society's founder, met 22 founding members at the Old Slaughters Coffee House in London, England. Brought together by their mutual concern for animal welfare, they established the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So this year, RSPCA celebrated their bicentennial. It should be noted that the Royal was added to the name in 1840 with the permission of Queen Victoria, who owned many dogs herself, and there was some legislation to protect animals. Much of this was related to the popularity of dog shows and the improvements they made in establishing specific breeds of dogs and standardizing them through the Kennel Club's standards for the different breeds. My sincere apologies if I butchered any of the names in this podcast. I enjoyed researching this section of the podcast, and I'm always intrigued by some of the names of the places in Great Britain, like Newcastle upon Tyne, Battersea, and, of course, Old Slaughter Coffee Shop. These names are all steeped in history. The more I read, the more I want to know. It's just fascinating. I'd like to encourage all of you to go to a dog show if you've never been to one. In episode 3, I talked about attending our first dog show, and I also covered how to find them and what to expect at a dog show. You'll be amazed at all the dogs that you'll see. Today on Facebook, one of my friends put in a TikTok feed, and it was really funny. It was a lady that had been interested in rescue for many years and highly involved in rescue, but she'd never attended a dog show. And she went to a dog show and was just blown away by the dogs that she saw and the treatment of the dogs and how nice all the people were at the dog show. It was really kind of funny because she thought she could go to a dog show and people would be sort of snooty, and they certainly weren't. She was literally blown away by the quality of the dogs, and they looked nothing like the dogs that she'd seen in rescue and that non-reputable breeders produce. In fact, she went as far to say, "I've seen way too many dogs from unethical breeders." That's what she called them. And that's what ends up in rescue. She said, "These dogs never end up in rescue. We never see them." For those of you like me who love Bassets, the best type of show to go to is what we call a specialty show. That means it's only Basset Hounds. These are held every year by the National Club and the local Basset Hound clubs that you might have in your area. The National Basset Hound Club of America show is held every fall, and it changes locations. It's held in different parts of the country each year. And you can find out information about that by going to their website at basset-hounds.com. bhca.org. While you're on that website, you can also find information about the local Basset Hound clubs, and you may have one in your area. They include contact information for the clubs, so you can contact the club and find out more information, and especially find out when and where they have their dog show every year. Just as a reminder from previous episodes, do not take your dog to a dog show. You'll be free to get closer to the dogs and people. Besides, it's actually against AKC rules for outside dogs to attend a dog show. They've determined that it's really not safe for dogs that aren't used to being around all the other dogs. So how did Basset Hounds fit into the dog shows and they're used for hunting, and how did these affect the development of the breed? When and why did Basset Hounds become household pets in addition to showing and hunting? These are all great questions for future episodes. Well, I hope you enjoyed the beginning of Bonnie's story. In the next episode, I'm going to get back to Mandy's story because we attempted to do our first breeding and become breeders. Well, it didn't turn out so well, and you'll get all those details in the next episode. I'll also include information about Basset Hounds and the AKC standard for Basset Hounds in the next episode. I greatly appreciate all of you. Hi. How you doing? Thank you for the kisses. Thank you very much. I appreciate those kisses. So you have Lexi down there too. Well, hi, Lex. How you doing? You Google girl. I hope we picked up some of you from the internet fraud episodes that I did. If you haven't seen those, please go back and look at those. It's extremely important information. And again, in episodes 1 through 9, I talk about our beginnings as Basset Hound owners, and eventually, as we'll talk about in the next episode, becoming Basset Hound breeders. Thank you all very much for watching.
WOEBGON the Basset Hound podcast is published in visual form on YouTube the first Monday of every month. A full-length audio version of each episode is published 1 week later wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our WOEBGON Basset's website for show notes including photos from every episode. You can also find links to the podcast plus information on Don and his wife Pam plus their Basset Hounds. WOEBGON the Basset Hound podcast is produced, researched, and hosted by Don Bullock. The music is Do Your Ears Hang Low played by Nasrality from the Philippines. It's available royalty-free on Pixabay. Please give this podcast a thumbs up on YouTube and a high rating wherever you listen to podcasts.
Until next time, this is Don. Thank you very much for listening.